Hey guys, tonight we wander through the freezing stone halls of a medieval castle during one of the harshest winters imaginable. Snow falls endlessly beyond the walls, the wind screams through narrow cracks in the stone, and somewhere deep inside the fortress, exhausted servants are still carrying firewood long after midnight. You arrive just before the gates close for the season, which is honestly terrible timing on your part. Because while castles look impressive in movies, you probably wouldn't survive this. Most people inside are cold, hungry, sleep-deprived, and smell like damp sheep wrapped in wet blankets. Medieval luxury is relative. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in tonight, comment your location and local time below. It's always strangely comforting knowing who else around the world is listening beside the fire tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You travel along a frozen dirt road as the final light of evening fades behind thick gray clouds. Snow crunches beneath your worn leather boots, though, honestly, boots might be generous. They feel more like damp sacks tied to your feet. Ahead of you, rising above the winter fog, stands the castle. Its massive stone walls cut into the dark sky like a mountain built by human hands. Small fires flicker behind narrow windows. Smoke rises lazily from chimneys before disappearing into the storm clouds overhead. Even from a distance, the fortress feels alive. Not warm exactly, just crowded with people trying very hard not to freeze to death. A horn echoes across the countryside. The gates are preparing to close. You hurry forward with a group of late travelers, merchants, laborers, a priest wrapped in thick wool, and one suspiciously cheerful man dragging 3 chickens through the snow. Nobody speaks much. It's too cold for conversation. Every breath leaves a pale cloud hanging in the air. As you approach the outer wall, the scale of the castle becomes almost overwhelming. Wooden watchtowers loom above you. Guards wrapped in heavy cloaks stare down from the battlements, gripping spears with stiff, red hands. One of them looks deeply annoyed to still be alive in this weather. The drawbridge groans beneath your weight as you cross over the frozen moat. Ice clings to the edges of the water below. The smell changes immediately once you enter the gatehouse. Outside smells like snow and pine trees. Inside smells like wet straw, horse manure, smoke, and humanity. A very medieval combination. Servants rush across the courtyard carrying sacks of grain before the storm worsens. Blacksmiths hammer at broken horseshoes near glowing furnaces. Stable boys lead nervous horses into shelter. Somewhere nearby, dogs bark wildly at absolutely nothing. You stand there for a moment, snow melting slowly from your cloak, while the castle swallows you whole. Winter preparation has consumed every corner of the fortress. Barrels of salted fish are rolled into underground storage rooms. Firewood is stacked carefully beneath covered sheds. Workers haul buckets of water before the wells partially freeze overnight. Chickens are pushed into cramped wooden pens. Everyone moves quickly because once the heavy snow arrives, life becomes much harder. Historians still debate whether medieval winters during parts of the Little Ice Age were even harsher than many modern depictions suggest. But surviving any winter inside a stone castle was miserable enough regardless. Castles were built for defense, not comfort. Thick stone walls trapped cold air beautifully. You quickly discover this unfortunate design choice. A servant leads travelers into the great hall, where dozens of people gather beneath enormous wooden beams blackened by years of smoke. Fire crackles inside a central hearth, though the heat barely reaches the edges of the room. You instinctively move closer anyway, joining the silent crowd orbiting the flames like desperate moths. The hall never truly becomes quiet. Metal cups clatter against wooden tables. Wet boots scrape across stone floors. Someone coughs constantly in the corner. A baby cries somewhere beneath layers of wool blankets. Above everything hangs the heavy smell of smoke drifting towards ceiling vents that don't work particularly well. Your eyes sting after only a few minutes. Oddly enough, many medieval castles had rooms specifically designed to release smoke through roof openings, yet plenty still remained painfully smoky inside. Wealthy nobles sometimes believed watery eyes from smoke were simply part of daily life, which feels like a very depressing level of acceptance. A servant hands you a rough piece of bread beside a bowl of thick stew. The stew contains onions, barley, and maybe meat, or possibly root vegetables pretending to be meat. It's difficult to know. Medieval cooking occasionally operated on optimism. Still, the food is warm, and tonight, warmth matters more than flavor. Near the far end of the hall, musicians quietly play string instruments while noble guests speak beside candlelight. Their fur-lined cloaks look impossibly luxurious compared to the patched clothing worn by servants nearby. The contrast is impossible to ignore. A lord laughs loudly while a freezing kitchen worker scrubs spilled ale from the floor beside him. Some things never really change. You settle near the fire as snow begins tapping softly against narrow windows. Outside, darkness spreads across the countryside. Travelers arriving after the gates close may not survive the night in such conditions. A guard passes near the hearth and mutters that wolves were seen near the forest edge earlier today. Wonderful. The fire pops loudly. You pull your cloak tighter around yourself while studying the hall around you. Tapestries hang from stone walls to reduce drafts, though many still sway gently whenever cold wind slips through unseen cracks. Candles flicker across long wooden tables scarred by knives, spilled wine, and decades of arguments. Above you hangs the distant sound of footsteps echoing through upper chambers. The castle never truly sleeps. Even now, servants continue hauling supplies through corridors lit only by torchlight. Somewhere below your feet, cooks prepare tomorrow's bread before dawn arrives. Guards rotate watch along the outer walls every few hours to avoid freezing solid in the wind. Scholars still argue whether castle life felt more psychologically exhausting than physically difficult during winters like these. Endless darkness, overcrowding, smoke inhalation, disease, and isolation created enormous mental strain. People survived together because there was no alternative. Another gust of wind rattles the shutters. A child near the fire begins crying again. And slowly, as the storm thickens outside the ancient walls, you realize something unsettling. Winter here has only just begun. Morning arrives reluctantly, not with sunlight exactly, but with a dull gray glow leaking through the castle's narrow windows, like the sky itself is too tired to continue. The fire in the great hall has burned low overnight, leaving behind soft orange embers and the unmistakable smell of wet ash. You wake stiff and cold beneath a rough wool blanket that somehow feels both scratchy and damp at the same time, which, unfortunately, is a very medieval achievement. Around you, dozens of other people slowly untangle themselves from sleep. Some groan softly while stretching sore backs. Others simply stare into the fading fire with the hollow expression of people realizing they survived another freezing night and now must immediately begin working again. Nobody wakes up refreshed here. A servant crosses the hall carrying fresh firewood while muttering under his breath about frozen water buckets. Nearby, a man snores loudly despite the chaos around him. Honestly impressive. You suspect he could sleep through an invasion. The cold feels sharper this morning. During medieval winters, temperatures inside large stone castles often dropped dangerously low at night. especially in shared halls where heat dispersed quickly through high ceilings and drafty corridors. Wealthy nobles sometimes used portable metal braziers filled with hot coals for warmth, though these occasionally filled rooms with toxic fumes instead. So even luxury came with risks. You sit up slowly and discover one deeply unpleasant truth about sleeping near the central hearth. The closer side of your body feels overheated. The other side feels frozen, like a badly cooked pie. Around the hall, people begin their routines with quiet exhaustion. Servants sweep away scraps from last night's meal. Stable boys stumble sleepily toward the courtyard, carrying buckets. Someone coughs violently into a cloth near the doorway. The sound echoes longer than it should. Illness travels easily in winter, especially here. You rise carefully, your boots stiff from yesterday's melted snow, and move toward the fire where a kettle hangs above glowing coals. A woman pours weak ale into wooden cups for the early workers. Medieval people often drank low-alcohol ale daily because clean water could be unreliable, particularly in crowded settlements. The brewing process sometimes made drinks safer than untreated water, which means breakfast is technically beer. History can be surprisingly efficient. You sip carefully. It tastes sour, warm, and vaguely disappointing. Still, it sends heat through your hands, and for a moment, that feels almost luxurious. Almost. The great hall gradually empties as workers disappear into different parts of the castle. Curiosity pulls you toward the corridors beyond the main chamber. You wrap your cloak tightly and step into the stone passageways where cold air drifts like invisible water through the castle. The walls here sweat with moisture. Torches flicker weakly against rough stone while servants hurry past carrying linens, firewood, and baskets of onions. Everyone walks quickly because stopping means feeling the cold properly. One elderly servant pauses beside a window slit to rub warmth back into his fingers before continuing downstairs. You notice something strange about the castle sounds during winter. Nothing is ever completely silent. Somewhere, distant hammering echoes through the walls. Doors creak constantly. Wind whistles through narrow openings with a sound almost like quiet singing. Rats scratch beneath floorboards. Footsteps rise and fade overhead like restless ghosts wandering the upper chambers. The castle breathes around you. You pass through a side corridor lined with faded tapestries showing hunting scenes from decades earlier. Noblemen on horseback chase deer through bright green forests that feel impossibly distant compared to the frozen world outside. Dust clings thickly to the fabric edges. One tapestry moves slightly. Not because of ghosts, just another draft. Though honestly, the medieval residents might disagree with you there. Superstition thrives inside places like this. During long winters, many people genuinely believed spirits wandered cold corridors after dark. Some servants refused to cross certain stairwells alone at night. Others carried small charms for protection against demons, witches, or wandering souls trapped between worlds. Scholars still argue whether these beliefs mainly came from religious teachings or from the psychological strain of isolation and fear during harsh winters. Probably both. Human imagination becomes extremely active when surrounded by darkness, cold, and questionable plumbing. You reach a narrow staircase, spiraling downward into the lower levels of the castle. The temperature changes immediately. Damp air presses against your face, while the smell of earth and mildew grows stronger with every step. Below ground, servants organize winter supplies inside crowded storage chambers. Barrels of salted herring line the walls beside sacks of grain. Wheels of hard cheese sit stacked carefully on wooden shelves. Dried herbs hang from ceiling beams. Everything is counted obsessively because food shortages during winter can become deadly very quickly. A steward argues loudly with two workers over missing turnips. Apparently, medieval castle drama remains timeless. You watch laborers carry heavy barrels deeper underground, where temperatures remain more stable. Preservation matters enormously here. Fresh food disappears quickly once heavy snow blocks travel routes. During severe winters, some castles became nearly isolated for weeks at a time. One young servant quietly admits that everyone fears the stores won't last until spring. Nobody responds, which somehow feels worse. Nearby, you notice several cats wandering freely between the barrels. Medieval castles often kept cats for pest control, since rats could destroy precious food supplies. Though judging by the size of some rats here, the cats may actually be negotiating territory agreements instead. A cook brushes past carrying onions and salted pork toward the kitchens upstairs. You follow the delicious smell instinctively through another corridor where warmth slowly returns to the air. Then you hear it. Laughter. Real laughter. It spills from behind a wooden doorway where several kitchen workers gather briefly beside enormous ovens glowing with heat. Compared to the rest of the castle, the kitchens feel almost tropical. Steam rises into the air while cooks knead dough, stir thick soups, and argue about absolutely everything. One woman jokes that if winter worsens further, they'll simply roast the steward next. The steward does not appear amused. You stand near the ovens longer than necessary, mostly because your hands have finally stopped feeling like frozen stones. The warmth here attracts everyone eventually. Servants, guards, messengers, even exhausted stable boys pretending to deliver something important. Outside, snow continues falling steadily beyond the narrow windows. Inside, the castle prepares itself for another endless night. And somewhere deep within these ancient walls, beneath smoke-blackened beams and flickering torchlight, you begin understanding the strange rhythm of winter life here. Survival depends on heat, heat depends on work, and work never truly ends. By the third morning inside the castle, you stop expecting warmth. That sounds dramatic, but medieval winter has a very efficient way of lowering your standards. At first, you dream about roaring fireplaces, thick blankets, and cheerful feasts like the ones painted in historical dramas. Then reality arrives, wearing wet boots and smelling faintly of cabbage. Mostly cabbage. Snow now covers the entire courtyard beyond the castle walls. From the narrow window near the great hall, the world outside looks buried beneath pale silence. Trees bend beneath heavy frost. The frozen moat has become a dull sheet of cracked ice. Even the dogs seem less enthusiastic about existing. Inside, life continues through routine alone. You wake before sunrise to the sound of servants dragging benches across the hall floor. Somewhere nearby, a cook curses aggressively at burned bread. A child whimpers softly in sleep beneath a pile of rough blankets. The fire never fully dies during the night anymore, but it shrinks enough for the cold to creep back into everyone's bones by dawn. Your stomach growls almost immediately, which means breakfast is approaching. A servant places wooden bowls along the tables with the emotional energy of someone deeply betrayed by life choices. Thick oat porridge steams weakly in the cold air. Beside it sits dark bread, dense enough to qualify as defensive equipment. You take a bite. Your jaw experiences regret. Medieval bread often contained coarse grains, bran, and sometimes bits of husk left from imperfect milling methods. Poorer bread could become incredibly hard during winter months, especially when stored for long periods. Wealthier nobles enjoyed finer white bread, though common people rarely saw it. Basically, status determined how difficult your breakfast was to chew. You dip the bread into the porridge for survival purposes. Around the hall, conversation stays quiet this morning. Winter exhaustion has settled over the castle like an invisible blanket. People speak less when they're cold for too long. Even laughter feels expensive.
At the far table, a group of guards tear pieces from smoked meat while discussing rumors from nearby villages. One claims wolves attacked livestock north of the forest road. Another insists bandits froze to death beside an abandoned chapel last week. Cheerful breakfast discussion. You notice something else too. Everyone watches the food carefully. Not greedily exactly, more cautiously. Supplies matter now in ways modern life rarely understands. Every sack of grain, every wheel of cheese, every barrel of ale represents survival stretched across uncertain months. A kitchen worker carries in strips of salted pork hanging from wooden hooks. The meat smells intensely smoky and painfully salty. Medieval preservation relied heavily on salt because winter made fresh food scarce. Fish, pork, and beef were often cured aggressively enough to survive months in storage, which means hydration becomes a fantasy. You taste a small piece anyway. Instant thirst. A nearby servant laughs quietly at your expression and hands you weak ale without saying a word. There's a strange solidarity forming among the people trapped inside these walls. Nobody enjoys winter here, but everyone understands it together. Outside the hall, the corridors feel even colder today. Wind slips through unseen cracks, carrying the sharp scent of snow. You pass servants stuffing extra cloth into gaps around door frames in a losing battle against drafts. The castle itself seems to complain constantly during winter. Wooden beams creak overhead, iron hinges groan, shutters rattle whenever strong wind strikes the outer walls. At night, these sounds become strangely unsettling. Every noise feels larger in darkness. Some residents genuinely believe spirits move through the castle after midnight. And honestly, around 2 a.m, listening to distant footsteps echo through freezing corridors, you start understanding why. You wander toward the outer courtyard where workers struggle beside stacks of firewood dusted with snow. Several men split frozen logs while breathing clouds into the air. Their hands look painfully red despite thick gloves. Firewood disappears alarmingly fast in winter. Large medieval castles consumed enormous quantities of wood daily just to keep kitchens functioning and halls partially heated. Some estates maintained entire woodland areas specifically for fuel supplies. Without constant labor, castles became unlivable surprisingly quickly. A stable boy hurries past, carrying hay toward the animal shelters. You follow partly from curiosity, and partly because stables are warmer than most corridors. Animals produce heat. A revolutionary medieval technology. Inside the stable, horses shift restlessly beneath dim lantern light while workers spread fresh straw across the floor. The smell hits immediately. Hay, manure, damp leather, sweat. Strangely comforting after endless smoke-filled hallways. One older servant explains that some poorer families outside castle walls occasionally kept animals inside homes during severe winters for extra warmth. Chickens, goats, even pigs sometimes shared living spaces with humans. Scholars still argue how common this practice truly was across different medieval regions, though archaeological evidence suggests it happened more often than people might prefer imagining while eating dinner. A horse nudges your shoulder, searching for food. At least someone here remains optimistic. Back inside the main keep, preparations for the evening meal begin early. The kitchens roar with activity, while smoke curls toward dark ceiling beams stained nearly black after generations of cooking fires. Massive iron pots bubble above open flames. Cooks chop onions endlessly. Bread bakes inside clay ovens, radiating precious heat into nearby rooms. The kitchens have become the emotional center of the castle. Not because life improves there, just because nobody's toes go numb immediately. You help carry wooden trenchers into the great hall, where servants arrange tables before sunset. Candles flicker softly against stone walls, while snow taps steadily outside. There's a sleepy rhythm to everything now. The castle adapts to winter, the same way sailors adapt to storms. Through repetition Tonight's meal arrives in heavy bowls of pottage thick with barley, leeks, and tiny scraps of meat floating like rare treasures. Pottage formed the backbone of many medieval diets because almost anything edible could disappear into it eventually. Honestly, medieval cooking invented just throw it in the pot centuries before college students perfected the art. Near the hearth, a traveling musician plucks quietly at a lute, while nobles sip warmed wine spiced with cinnamon and cloves imported through expensive trade routes. The smell drifts beautifully across the hall, reaching people who will never taste it. You watch servants glance toward the noble tables before returning silently to work. The divide between comfort and hardship feels sharpest during meals. Still, the fire burns brighter tonight. Snow continues falling beyond the windows, and slowly, while smoke curls lazily toward the rafters, and tired voices blend into soft echoes around the hall, the brutal rhythm of castle winter begins feeling strangely familiar. Not pleasant, but familiar.
The deeper you move into castle life, the more you realize something important. The nobles may own the fortress, but the servants keep it alive. Without them, the fires die, the food disappears, the animals freeze, and the entire grand stone castle slowly turns into an expensive icy tomb. Every warm meal, every lit candle, every dry blanket exists because exhausted workers spend every waking hour fighting against winter itself, and winter is winning aggressively. You wake before dawn again, though wake suggests you actually slept well. The great hall remains crowded through the night, filled with shifting bodies, coughing travelers, and the constant crackle of firewood. At some point, a man near the hearth began snoring loud enough to challenge medieval engineering. Nobody stopped him, probably out of fear. The hall smells stronger this morning. Smoke, sweat, damp wool, stale ale, and wet straw have merged into one permanent castle scent. Your clothes now carry it too. At this point, you could probably be identified by smell alone from several villages away. A bell rings somewhere above the hall. Servants immediately begin moving, not slowly either. The entire castle snaps awake with mechanical precision. Kitchen workers hurry toward the ovens, while stable boys rush outside into the freezing courtyard carrying feed buckets. Maids gather blankets from sleeping areas. Someone drags another pile of firewood through the corridor, leaving melted snow streaked across the floor. You follow the movement through narrow passageways lit by weak torchlight. Morning inside the servant corridors feels completely different from the noble chambers upstairs. Here, nobody speaks elegantly beside fireplaces. Workers pass one another with tired nods while carrying impossible amounts of labor before sunrise even fully arrives. A young servant named Edith struggles beside a wooden bucket nearly half her size. She cannot be older than 14. Medieval castles relied heavily on child labor for daily tasks because survival demanded constant work from nearly everyone capable of standing upright. Childhood, historically speaking, was often more of a suggestion. You help her carry water through the corridor where icy drafts snake across the floor. The bucket sloshes constantly, soaking your boots. Edith complains quietly that one of the upper wells partially froze overnight, meaning everyone must now haul water from farther away. Nobody thanks you for helping, not because they're rude, just because there's no time. You pass through a lower chamber where laundresses stand beside steaming tubs, scrubbing clothes by hand. The room feels warmer from boiling water, though thick humidity clings to the walls. One woman wrings out heavy wool garments while muttering that noble families somehow create more laundry than actual humans should physically produce. A fair criticism, honestly. Laundry during medieval winters was exhausting. Clothes dried slowly in damp conditions, and clean garments remained difficult to maintain inside smoky castles. Wealthier residents owned multiple layers, while poorer workers often re-wore the same clothing constantly, which explains many smells currently haunting the corridor. You continue upward along a spiral staircase so narrow two people can barely pass each other. Your shoulder brushes cold stone constantly. Tiny arrow-slit windows reveal flashes of white snow outside. The castle looks beautiful from a distance. Inside, it feels like surviving inside a refrigerator designed by paranoid architects. At the top of the stairs, servants prepare one of the noble sleeping chambers before the Lord's family wakes. Thick furs cover the bed while tapestries hang across walls to reduce drafts. A small brazier glows beside the room, filling the air with faint charcoal heat. Compared to the great hall downstairs, this chamber feels absurdly luxurious. Still cold, though, just slightly less aggressively cold. One maid quietly explains that nobles sometimes slept wearing hats during winter because bedrooms became freezing overnight. Another mentions people occasionally used heated stones wrapped in cloth beneath blankets for warmth, which honestly sounds less like comfort and more like medieval survival improvisation. You notice chamber pots tucked discreetly beside the bed curtains. Castles often lacked proper sanitation systems, especially in sleeping areas. Some larger fortresses contained garderobes, small toilet spaces built into walls where waste dropped downward into pits or moats below. A truly magical image for anyone admiring medieval architecture. Outside the chamber windows, snow falls thicker now. The courtyard below has transformed into a blur of white movement and dark cloaks. Workers continue hauling supplies despite the weather. Nobody stops because stopping means disaster later. Food still needs cooking. Fires still need feeding. Animals still need care. Winter does not negotiate. As midday approaches, you return downstairs following the smell of baking bread drifting through the corridors. The kitchens roar louder than ever today. Steam fogs the air while cooks argue across crowded tables piled with onions, carrots, salted fish, and heavy black loaves fresh from the ovens. You help knead dough beside an elderly baker missing several teeth. He tells stories constantly while working. Apparently, he once traveled with soldiers during a border conflict decades ago, though his stories grow slightly more heroic every time he repeats them. By spring, he may personally defeat entire armies using bread. The baker mentions an odd detail about winter castle life. People become obsessed with tiny comforts: a slightly warmer blanket, an extra candle before bed, a spoonful of honey in hot ale. During endless cold months, even small luxuries feel enormous. Morale matters almost as much as food. Scholars still argue whether psychological exhaustion caused more suffering during long medieval winters than physical hardship alone. Isolation, darkness, and monotony wore people down slowly over time. Castle residents survived through routine, community, religion, and occasional distractions. Also, alcohol. Quite a lot of alcohol. Later in the afternoon, you accompany servants carrying firewood into the upper corridors. The logs feel heavy against your arms while icy wind slips through open stairwells. Somewhere above, noble guests laugh during a private gathering while musicians perform softly beside the hearth. Below them, workers continue climbing endless stairs with wood, water, food, and laundry. The castle depends on invisible labor, and invisible labor rarely rests. As evening settles across the fortress, candles flicker alive one by one through the corridors. Outside, the storm darkens the sky until the world beyond the walls nearly disappears completely. Inside the great hall, exhausted servants finally gather near the fire for supper. Not because work is finished, just because tomorrow will begin again soon enough.
By now, the castle no longer feels unfamiliar. The sounds have become part of you. The crackling hearths, the endless footsteps overhead, the distant barking dogs somewhere beyond the snowy courtyard. Even the wind has developed its own personality, sometimes whispering softly through cracks in the stone, other times screaming across the battlements like an angry spirit denied entry. And tonight, the castle feels different, busier, warmer somehow. Not physically warmer, unfortunately. Medieval architecture remains deeply committed to personal suffering, but emotionally warmer. Torches burn brighter in the corridors. Extra candles glow beside the tapestries. Servants rush through the halls carrying polished cups, folded linens, and trays of roasted meat. A noble gathering is happening upstairs, which means everyone below stairs is working twice as hard. You help carry firewood toward the upper chambers while snow falls steadily outside the narrow windows. The staircase twists upward through cold stone towers until eventually the atmosphere changes. The servant corridors smell like smoke and sweat. The noble floors smell faintly of beeswax candles, roasted spices, and expensive perfume, attempting unsuccessfully to overpower medieval hygiene. Honestly, it's trying its best. At the entrance to the Lord's private hall, guards stand watch beside heavy wooden doors, reinforced with iron bands. Their fur-lined cloaks look thick enough to survive actual civilization. One glances toward you before allowing the servants through. Inside, warmth finally exists. Not modern warmth, but enough to surprise you. Massive fireplaces blaze against the walls, while long tables glow beneath candlelight reflected in polished silver cups. Rich tapestries cover nearly every exposed stone surface to trap heat. Animal furs drape across benches and chairs. The air smells of spiced wine, roasted boar, and fresh bread instead of damp straw and exhaustion. The difference between upstairs and downstairs feels almost unreal. Noble families during medieval winters often consumed dramatically richer diets than servants or peasants. Imported spices like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg became symbols of wealth because trade routes made them expensive luxuries. Serving heavily spiced food demonstrated status as much as taste. Basically, medieval rich people invented subtle food bragging. Musicians play softly near the fireplace, while noble guests speak in relaxed voices. Their clothing alone could probably fund several villages. Deep green velvet, embroidered sleeves, silver jewelry glinting beneath candlelight. One noble woman wears a fur collar so enormous, it practically deserves its own political title. You stand quietly near the walls while servants refill goblets and replace trenchers between courses. The contrast between this room and the freezing servant corridors below feels almost absurd. Downstairs, workers huddle beside weak fires sharing thin stew. Upstairs, guests debate hunting falcons while eating honey-glazed pastries. History rarely distributes comfort fairly. Still, not everything here feels relaxed. You begin noticing tension hidden beneath the laughter. The Lord sits near the central fireplace, speaking quietly with two visiting knights. Their expressions remain serious even while musicians continue playing nearby. Maps lie partially rolled across the table beside them. One knight points toward a northern region while speaking in low tones. Winter changes politics too. Travel becomes dangerous, supplies grow limited. Local disputes intensify when survival feels uncertain. Medieval nobles spent enormous energy protecting trade routes, managing food stores, and maintaining alliances during harsh winters. A servant beside you whispers that nearby villages have struggled with poor harvests this year. That explains the guarded conversations. At the far end of the hall, a young nobleman attempts poetry beside the fireplace, while everyone politely suffers through it. His voice rises dramatically as he compares a woman's eyes to moonlit rivers or something equally exhausting. Even the musicians look tired. One servant quietly mutters that the wine must be strong tonight. You nearly laugh aloud. Humor survives surprisingly well in difficult conditions. Castle workers gossip constantly about nobles, guards, priests, and one another. Sarcasm becomes its own survival tool. Without jokes, winter would probably feel twice as long. A platter of roasted chestnuts passes through the room, filling the air with sweet, smoky warmth. You steal one while carrying empty cups back toward the kitchens, an act of tremendous medieval criminality. Back downstairs, reality returns immediately. The servant corridors remain freezing despite crowded movement through the halls. Kitchen workers scrub dishes beside steaming water while cooks prepare tomorrow's bread long before midnight. Smoke clings heavily to the ceiling beams. Someone argues over missing onions with the emotional intensity of a battlefield commander. The onions are eventually discovered. Peace returns briefly. You pause near the ovens, warming your hands while listening to distant laughter echo faintly from the noble chambers above. It's strange hearing two different worlds existing inside the same castle walls, one filled with fur cloaks and silver goblets, the other with aching backs and frozen fingers. Scholars still argue whether medieval servants viewed noble luxury with resentment or simple acceptance. Social hierarchy shaped daily life so completely that many people considered inequality part of the natural order. Yet surviving records occasionally reveal frustration, complaints, and quiet resistance among workers, which feels deeply human. As the night grows later, snow begins striking the windows harder. Wind rattles the shutters with sudden force. Guards entering from the battlements stomp ice from their boots beside the kitchen fire before returning outside again. One mentions the storm may worsen by morning. Wonderful news for absolutely nobody. You carry fresh logs toward the great hall, where travelers settle beside the hearth for another crowded night. The firelight flickers softly across exhausted faces. Some people mend clothing quietly. Others stare into the flames with distant expressions. A woman hums softly while rocking a child to sleep. Nearby, an old soldier tells stories about winters during past wars when men froze beside campfires before dawn arrived. His voice drifts lazily through the smoky air while snow piles higher outside the walls. The castle feels smaller during storms like this, more isolated, almost floating alone inside endless darkness. You pull your cloak tighter and settle closer to the hearth while the wind howls somewhere beyond the stone corridors. Above you, nobles continue feasting beneath candlelight. Below ground, servants prepare tomorrow's meals beside glowing ovens. And all around you, hidden inside thick walls built centuries earlier, hundreds of people endure winter together, one freezing night at a time.
Long before sunrise, the kitchens are already awake. You smell them before you see them. Smoke, rising dough, boiling onions, burning fat, damp firewood, and something suspiciously close to overcooked cabbage drift through the stone corridors like a warning from the future. Somewhere ahead, metal crashes against stone, followed immediately by shouting. The castle kitchens, you discover, do not believe in peaceful mornings. You leave the fading warmth of the great hall and follow servants carrying baskets through narrow passageways toward the lower kitchens. The air grows warmer with every step downward until finally the heat hits you all at once. Thick, smoky, almost overwhelming after days spent freezing beside drafty walls. For a brief moment, you consider living here permanently beside the ovens, a reasonable medieval life goal. The kitchen chambers spread beneath enormous blackened beams, stained by decades of smoke. Fires roar beneath giant iron cauldrons, while cooks move through steam like exhausted ghosts. Every surface holds something: onions, trenchers, sacks of grain, herbs hanging from hooks, half-plucked chickens, wooden bowls, knives dulled from years of use. And somehow, everyone is yelling simultaneously. A cook storms past, carrying a tray of eels with the expression of a man one inconvenience away from declaring war on civilization itself. Another kneads dough aggressively enough to frighten nearby children. You quickly understand why kitchens became emotional pressure cookers during winter. Everyone depends on them. A castle this large consumes shocking amounts of food daily. Bread must constantly bake. Soups simmer endlessly over the fires. Meat requires salting, smoking, or roasting. Ale barrels need replacing. Wealthy households could feed hundreds of residents, workers, guests, guards, and travelers every single day. And winter makes everything harder. A kitchen boy hands you a bundle of firewood and points toward the ovens without explanation. Congratulations. You work here now. The heat near the bread ovens feels incredible after the frozen corridors upstairs. Bakers slide heavy loaves into deep clay chambers while flour drifts through the smoky air like pale snow. One elderly woman shapes dough beside the fire while humming quietly to herself. She informs you that fresh bread improves morale, then immediately threatens someone with a spoon. Honestly, both statements feel connected. Medieval bread varied enormously depending on wealth and circumstance. Nobles enjoyed fine white loaves made from sifted wheat flour, while poorer workers often ate darker bread containing rye, oats, barley, or mixed grains. During severe shortages, desperate communities sometimes added beans, chestnuts, or even ground peas into flour mixtures. History occasionally turns recipes into survival strategies. A servant nearby stirs a massive cauldron of pottage thick enough to support structural foundations. Steam rises around his face while bits of leek and barley circle lazily through the broth. Pottage appears at nearly every meal here. Breakfast pottage, supper pottage, possibly emotional support pottage. The ingredients change slightly depending on available supplies, but the concept remains eternal. Put everything edible into a pot and hope winter eventually ends. You help chop onions beside another worker whose eyes have clearly accepted permanent suffering. Between cuts, he quietly explains the kitchen hierarchy. Head cooks answer directly to noble households. Bakers maintain the ovens. Scullions clean endlessly. Young servants carry water, wood, and ingredients through the castle all day. The work never stops, not even during storms, especially during storms. Outside, snow slams harder against the narrow kitchen windows now. Wind whistles down the chimney shafts, scattering sparks across the stone floor. A cook curses loudly while rescuing a pot from tipping over. One servant jokes that winter itself is trying to join the meal. Nobody laughs very hard. You notice workers constantly warming their hands near the ovens whenever possible. Fingers crack and bleed in weather like this. Even indoors, the cold creeps into joints and muscles eventually. Some servants wrap cloth around their hands while working. Others simply endure it silently. Scholars still argue how severe long-term winter labor affected medieval health, though skeletal evidence suggests arthritis, joint damage, and chronic pain appeared frequently among working populations. Surviving winter demanded physical endurance most modern people would find horrifying, including you. You nearly drop a bucket of water after carrying it across 2 icy corridors. A kitchen maid smirks at your struggle before effortlessly lifting twice the weight. Humbling experience. Near midday, fresh meat arrives from the storage rooms below. Salted pork, smoked fish, and preserved game wrapped carefully in cloth. Fresh meat during winter becomes rare unless hunting succeeds or animals are slaughtered before feed supplies run low. A hunter enters carrying 2 rabbits from traps set near the forest edge. The entire kitchen reacts like celebrities just arrived. One cook actually applauds. You help skin vegetables beside the fire while listening to conversations drifting through the room. Workers gossip about everything here. Noble arguments upstairs. Guards caught sleeping during patrol. A priest who drank too much mulled wine last night and accidentally blessed a dog. The dog apparently behaved very spiritually afterward. Laughter spreads briefly through the kitchen. Moments like this matter more than you expect. Winter isolates people. Endless cold, darkness, and repetitive labor slowly wear down the mind. Humor becomes protection against hopelessness. Shared meals, stories, songs, even complaints help people survive emotionally as much as physically. Outside the kitchen doorway, you glimpse servants carrying hot stones wrapped in cloth toward the noble chambers upstairs. Wealthier residents often placed heated stones or metal warming pans beneath blankets before sleep during winter nights. Which sounds comforting until you remember medieval fire safety standards were mostly optimistic suggestions. As evening approaches, the pace somehow becomes even more chaotic. Supper for the Great Hall must be prepared while noble meals require separate dishes entirely. Bread emerges continuously from the ovens. Stew thickens over the fires. Roasted onions caramelize beside spits turning slowly above glowing coals. The smell fills the entire lower corridor. For one beautiful moment, the castle almost feels cozy. Then someone drops an entire tray of pies. Silence falls across the kitchen. Absolute silence. Even the fires seem shocked. The head cook closes his eyes slowly, like a man reconsidering every decision that led him here. You quietly step backward, a wise survival instinct. Later, carrying bowls toward the great hall, you pass through torchlit corridors where shadows flicker across ancient stone. The castle hums around you, footsteps overhead, guards changing watch, distant music drifting from noble rooms upstairs. Behind all of it, hidden beneath layers of smoke and labor and exhaustion, the kitchens continue burning like the heart of the fortress itself. Because without these fires, winter wins, and everyone here knows it. The storm arrives fully sometime after midnight. You know this because the entire castle changes its voice. Normally, the fortress creaks softly in the cold, wood settling, shutters rattling, distant footsteps echoing through corridors. But tonight the wind roars across the battlements, hard enough to shake the walls themselves. Snow slams against narrow windows like handfuls of thrown sand. Somewhere high above, a loose iron chain bangs rhythmically against stone. Nobody sleeps deeply during weather like this, not even the guards. You wake beside the dying hearth in the great hall, while cold air slips beneath your blanket like icy water. Around you, travelers shift restlessly in their sleep. One child begins crying softly before a tired mother pulls him closer beneath heavy wool coverings. The fire crackles weakly. Outside, the storm howls louder. A servant hurries through the hall, adding fresh logs to the hearth before dawn. Sparks rise upward into the smoky rafters while shadows dance across the tapestries hanging along the walls. You try to fall asleep again. Then a horn sounds from outside, low, urgent. Every head lifts immediately. Another horn answers from somewhere farther along the walls. The guards are changing patrol routes because of the storm. You sit up, suddenly awake now, while several workers move toward the doors to listen. Wind screams through the cracks as the heavy hall entrance opens briefly. Snow swirls violently into the chamber before the doors slam shut again. One guard entering from outside looks half frozen already. Ice clings to his beard. His eyelashes actually have snow on them, which feels medically concerning. He stomps snow from his boots beside the fire while muttering that visibility along the outer walls has nearly vanished. Another guard claims the North Watchtower can barely see the forest anymore. You glance toward the dark windows. Beyond the castle walls, the entire world has disappeared into white chaos. Despite the storm, work continues before sunrise. It always continues. Servants carry water. Bakers prepare bread. Stable boys feed nervous horses while snow piles against the courtyard gates. And above all of them, guards patrol the walls. You eventually follow one of the stairways upward toward the battlements, partly from curiosity and partly because surviving medieval winter apparently requires terrible personal decisions. The spiral staircase narrows as you climb higher through the tower interior. Wind whistles faintly through arrow slits cut into the stone. The higher you climb, the colder everything becomes. At the top, a wooden door opens onto the outer wall walk. Instant regret. The wind strikes your face so hard it steals your breath immediately. Snow races sideways across the battlements beneath a sky the color of iron. Torches struggle against the gale, while guards wrapped in thick cloaks move slowly along the walls with spears in hand. The castle feels completely different up here. Below, inside the halls, winter feels distant and muffled by stone. Out here, it feels alive. The wall beneath your boots has turned slick with ice. Snow gathers against the crenellations overlooking the frozen countryside far below. Somewhere beyond the storm lies forest, villages, roads, rivers, an entire world currently erased by weather. A guard beside you squints into the white darkness and mutters that this storm reminds him of one from years earlier when travelers froze only half a mile from shelter. Medieval winters killed people constantly. not through dramatic battles or disasters necessarily. Just exposure, cold roads, failed harvests, starvation, illness spreading through weakened communities. During severe winters, isolated villages sometimes lost large portions of their population before spring returned. And standing here now, with wind clawing through your cloak and snow stinging your face, you begin understanding how fragile survival truly felt. The guard points toward the forest edge where movement flickers briefly between blowing snow, wolves, or possibly your imagination. Hard to know, honestly. Wolves carried enormous symbolic fear during medieval winters. Real attacks on humans remained relatively uncommon compared to folklore, but hungry wolves near isolated settlements terrified communities nonetheless. Stories spread quickly during harsh seasons, especially in remote regions where darkness and hunger amplified every rumor. Scholars still argue whether medieval wolf fears reflected actual danger or broader psychological anxieties surrounding wilderness, winter, and isolation. Either way, nobody here wants to test the theory personally. Another gust nearly knocks you sideways. The guards barely react. They've done this countless times before. One older watchman explains that patrols rotate constantly during storms because men can lose feeling in their hands and feet frighteningly fast. He flexes stiff fingers near a lantern while speaking. Frost gathers along the edges of his cloak. You notice something strange about the view from the walls. Beautiful things become terrifying in the right conditions. Snow drifting across distant forests would look peaceful from a warm room beside a fireplace. Up here it feels endless, unforgiving, like nature itself, reminding everyone inside the castle that stone walls only protect you for so long. A bell rings faintly below from the chapel tower. Morning prayers. The sound drifts strangely through the storm. You descend from the battlements with enormous relief, returning through winding staircases into the relative warmth of the inner corridors. Your cheeks burn painfully as feeling returns to them. Servants pass carrying baskets of wood while melted snow drips from their boots onto the stone floors. Life below continues despite the weather above. In the kitchens, cooks complain about frozen deliveries from nearby villages. The stables smell stronger today because animals remain indoors longer during storms. Smoke hangs thick through the great hall where travelers gather close beside the fire. Everyone feels slightly trapped now. The storm has sealed the castle away from the world outside, and isolation changes people. By afternoon, tension spreads quietly through the fortress. Guards speak in lower voices. Stewards count food stores again. Messengers arriving from nearby settlements bring stories about blocked roads and damaged farms buried beneath snowdrifts. One traveler claims an entire wagon disappeared off the forest road yesterday. Nobody confirms the story. Nobody dismisses it either. As darkness returns early across the frozen landscape, extra torches burn along the corridors tonight. The wind continues hammering the outer walls while snow collects higher against the gates. You settle once more near the great hall hearth, listening to the storm rage somewhere beyond layers of ancient stone. Above you, the castle groans softly in the cold. Around you, exhausted people eat quietly beside flickering firelight. And outside the walls, winter waits patiently in the dark.
A few days into the storm, people begin talking differently, more quietly. Not because the castle has become calmer. If anything, the fortress feels louder than ever. Wind screams across the towers day and night. Doors slam unexpectedly. Chimneys moan like distant animals trapped inside the walls. Somewhere in the lower corridors, pipes partially freeze and burst, sending servants rushing through ankle-deep water while swearing creatively. No, the quieter voices come from something else. People are getting sick. It begins subtly at first. A cough near the hearth, a feverish stable boy sleeping too long, a kitchen servant who suddenly stops showing up for work. Winter illnesses move through crowded castles with horrifying efficiency. Hundreds of people sleep, eat, and work together inside damp stone walls filled with smoke, poor ventilation, and very questionable hygiene practices. Once sickness enters the fortress, it spreads like fire through dry straw. And unfortunately, medieval medicine operates mostly on confidence. You notice the change during breakfast when one of the older guards struggles to lift his cup properly. His hands shake badly. Sweat shines across his forehead despite the cold hall. Another servant whispers that he developed a fever overnight. Nobody sits too close to him afterward. Fear travels faster than disease, especially in winter. By midday, you hear that the castle healer has been summoned to several chambers already. Curiosity eventually pulls you toward the small infirmary tucked beside one of the inner courtyards. The corridor outside smells sharply of herbs, smoke, and something bitter you cannot identify. Inside, warmth presses heavily against the air. Bundles of dried plants hang from ceiling beams while candles flicker beside wooden shelves crowded with jars, cloth wrappings, and handwritten remedies. A woman crushes herbs using a stone mortar while muttering instructions to a young assistant carrying steaming water. The castle healer looks exhausted, which is not encouraging. Medieval medicine blended practical knowledge, superstition, religious belief, and ancient theories inherited from Greek and Roman scholars. Treatments often focused on balancing the body's humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, believed to control human health and emotion, which means medieval healthcare occasionally resembled philosophy with herbs. You watch as the healer prepares a mixture of honey, garlic, and ground herbs for a coughing servant sitting near the fire. Surprisingly, some medieval remedies actually contained useful ingredients. Honey, for example, has mild antibacterial properties. Garlic also possesses limited antimicrobial effects. So history occasionally stumbled into medicine by accident. Unfortunately, other treatments prove less reassuring. In the corner of the room sits a bowl containing leeches. Actual leeches, quietly waiting for employment opportunities. Bloodletting remained a common practice throughout much of medieval Europe because physicians believed removing blood could restore bodily balance during illness. Scholars still argue how often such treatments genuinely helped versus weakened already vulnerable patients. You personally vote against the leeches, strongly. A young boy lies wrapped in blankets near the wall while his mother cools his forehead with damp cloth. His breathing sounds rough. Nearby, another servant drinks heated wine mixed with spices while trembling beside the fire. The room feels heavy with fear disguised as routine. Nobody says the word plague, but everyone thinks it. The memory of past epidemics lingers deeply in medieval communities. Stories survive for generations. Entire villages emptied, mass graves dug during winter, priests overwhelmed by endless funerals. Even ordinary fevers can trigger enormous panic when medical knowledge remains uncertain. Outside the infirmary windows, snow still falls steadily across the courtyard. The storm refuses to leave. You help carry extra firewood into the room while the healer quietly explains that cold weather weakens people faster than nobles understand. Poor diet, exhaustion, and crowded sleeping spaces create perfect conditions for illness. Then she glances toward the upper chambers where the noble family sleeps behind heavy tapestries and fur blankets. Even here, resentment slips through carefully. Back in the great hall, tension settles over the evening meal. Conversations remain muted while people watch one another carefully for signs of coughing or fever. Travelers who arrived healthy days ago now appear pale and exhausted. One man refuses to share cups anymore. Another quietly hangs protective charms beside his sleeping place. Superstition grows strongest when fear outruns explanation. Some castle residents burn herbs to clean the air. Others pray constantly. A servant whispers that evil spirits travel through storms looking for weakened souls. Another insists sickness spreads through foul smells rising from damp corridors and waste pits. Oddly enough, the smell theory comes surprisingly close to later disease concepts compared to demon explanations. Progress arrives slowly. Near the hearth, an elderly priest reads softly from a prayer book while several servants listen beside the firelight. Religion provides structure during uncertainty. If winter sickness cannot be controlled physically, at least it can be endured spiritually. Scholars still argue how much medieval faith comforted communities during epidemics versus increasing fear through ideas of divine punishment. Probably both happen simultaneously. Human beings are complicated like that. Later that evening, you accompany a servant delivering hot broth to one of the guard towers. The corridors feel strangely empty tonight. Doors remain closed. Footsteps echo farther than usual. People are staying near their own spaces now, protecting warmth, protecting health, protecting whatever fragile sense of safety still exists inside these walls. At the tower chamber, 2 guards sit beside a small brazier wrapped tightly in cloaks. One coughs repeatedly into his sleeve while staring into the coals. Nobody mentions it. Outside the narrow window slit, darkness swallows the snow-covered world completely. The storm has softened somewhat, but icy wind still drifts across the battlements, carrying sharp crystals of snow through the night air. The guard beside the fire mutters that winter always takes someone eventually. The room falls silent after that. You return downstairs slowly through torchlit corridors where shadows stretch long against damp stone walls. Somewhere distant, a woman sings quietly while comforting a sick child. Kitchen workers continue boiling broth through the night. The healer moves from chamber to chamber carrying herbs and exhaustion in equal measure. And beneath all the smoke, fear, and flickering candlelight, the castle waits uneasily for whatever winter plans next.